Rain hammered the empty street outside Kane Dynamics Tower when Alexandra Kane realized her car was not starting, and no one around her had any idea who she really was. She stood under a broken awning in a plain gray coat, phone dead, heels soaked, looking like any other stranded woman in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday night. A pickup truck slowed beside her, and the man behind the wheel rolled down the window without a word of introduction, only asking if she needed a ride. He wore a faded work jacket with a maintenance patch stitched crooked at the shoulder, and when he reached across to open the door, she noticed his hands, calloused in a way that did not match casual labor, and his eyes lifted once toward the tower behind her, with a familiarity that felt older than any job title could explain. She told herself he was simply a kind stranger. She had no idea that the man driving her home that night was the only person alive who had once tried to warn her company that the building behind her could fall. Why would a maintenance worker look at a 50-story tower like he already knew exactly where it was weak? Daniel Whitfield's mornings ran on quiet discipline. He was 38 years old, and every part of his small apartment on the north side of Pittsburgh reflected a man who had once been trusted with far larger responsibilities than packing a school lunch. He moved through the kitchen with the same economy of motion he once used, walking a construction site, checking each item twice, not out of anxiety but out of habit carved by years of consequences he never talked about. His daughter, Nora, 9 years old and always half a step behind schedule, sat at the counter finishing a drawing of a bridge made of colored pencil lines that did not quite meet in the middle. Daniel looked at it longer than she expected, then gently corrected one angle with his finger, the way an engineer corrects a load path without thinking twice about it. Nora did not notice. She only saw her father, tired from another overnight shift, humming along to the radio while he packed her lunch into a paper bag folded exactly the same way every morning. He drove her to school before his own shift began, and along the way, he passed the tower where he now worked nights, its glass face catching the early sun in a way that used to fill him with pride, instead of quiet unease. He had once known every beam inside that structure by memory, every calculation behind every column, and some nights, walking its empty halls with a mop instead of a set of blueprints, he still felt the building speaking to him in a language no one else in the company could read anymore. There had been a time, before Nora was born, when Daniel's name appeared on award plaques and industry panels, when younger engineers asked him to review their work before submitting it to their own supervisors. That version of his life felt distant now, packed away like the old blueprints in his closet, brought out only in memory during the long, quiet hours of a night shift when the building was empty enough to think. He never spoke of it to Nora. She knew her father as a careful, steady man who fixed things, and that was enough for both of them, at least for now. At the school gate, Nora hugged him quickly, the way children do when they are already thinking about their friends waiting inside, and told him not to forget her art show on Friday. He promised he would not, and meant it the way he meant very few things anymore, completely and without qualification. Driving away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror at her small figure disappearing through the doors, and something in his chest tightened the way it always did when he thought about how much he still had left to protect. Across the city, inside the glass offices of Kane Dynamics, Alexandra was already 3 meetings into her day before 8 in the morning. The tower launch was 17 days away, and every hour was accounted for down to the minute. She was 34 years old, sharp enough to run circles around men twice her age, and burdened by a legacy she had not entirely chosen for herself. The building was her father's final vision, before he passed away 2 years earlier, and its opening now carried more emotional weight than any deadline she had ever managed in her career. Pressure sat behind her eyes like a second, invisible job she could never clock out of, not even at home, not even in the rare quiet hour before sleep. Her assistant reminded her twice that morning about the anniversary falling during launch week, as though she could have possibly forgotten. She had not forgotten. She simply refused to let herself feel it fully until the ribbon was cut and her father's name was etched permanently into the lobby wall where everyone entering the building would see it. Between meetings, she caught herself glancing at an old photograph on her desk, her father standing at the base of the unfinished tower a decade earlier, hard hat under one arm, grinning like a man who had no idea how heavy the building would one day feel in his daughter's hands. Back at the tower that same afternoon, a fellow maintenance worker named Gary, a man who had worked alongside Daniel for 3 years without ever asking too many questions, mentioned offhand that the north sensor array had been acting up again. Daniel said little in response, only nodding and filing the comment away with the same quiet attention he gave everything else, the kind of attention that made Gary trust him without fully understanding why. That same night, deep inside the mechanical floors of the tower, Daniel walked his usual maintenance route and paused at a structural sensor panel that read slightly off from its expected baseline. To anyone else passing by, it would have looked like nothing at all, a flicker easily dismissed. To Daniel, standing alone in the dim hum of the machinery, it was the first small sign of something he had hoped never to see inside these walls again. Why did a routine maintenance check make a man like Daniel stop breathing for a second? Right there in an empty hallway, the press conference for the tower's grand opening filled the lobby with cameras, reporters, and a nervous energy Alexandra masked behind practiced composure. She stood at the podium beside Richard Voss, the company's longtime chief operating officer, and a man in his early 60s, whose calm exterior had steadied Kane Dynamics through 2 decades of expansion and 2 changes in leadership. Voss had been close to Alexandra's father, close enough that she had never once questioned his loyalty, and she trusted him the way people trust furniture that has always simply been in the room. Alexandra's father had started Kane Dynamics from a single rented office 30 years earlier, building it into one of the region's most respected development firms, through a reputation for quality that he guarded fiercely, sometimes at the expense of speed or profit. He had taught Alexandra everything she knew about the business, walking her through job sites as a teenager, teaching her to read blueprints before she learned to drive. When he died, and the board had offered her time to grieve before stepping into the role fully. She had taken exactly 1 week. The building itself was more than steel and glass to her. It was named for her father, built from his final blueprint, opening in the very same week as the anniversary of his death. Every question from the press circled back eventually to legacy, to safety, to whether Kane Dynamics could truly deliver on both promises at once without one collapsing under the weight of the other. A reporter near the front asked directly whether the tower had passed every required inspection, and Alexandra answered without hesitation that it had, her voice steady, even as something in the back of her mind flickered with uncertainty she could not name yet. Another reporter asked what her father would think of the finished building, and for a brief moment her composure slipped, just enough for the cameras to catch something unguarded, before she recovered with a practiced smile and moved to the next question. Behind the scenes, away from the cameras, Voss quietly intercepted a new inspection report from the engineering department before it could ever reach Alexandra's desk. He read it once at his own desk, folded it without comment, and later told her that everything had already been certified 100% safe for occupancy. It was a lie built on convenience, the same kind of convenience that had protected his career for years, without anyone once asking the right question at the right time. Voss had built his reputation over 2 decades on being the man who never let a problem reach the board unsolved, and in his mind, 5 years earlier, the situation with Daniel had simply been another problem he had efficiently handled, before it could grow into something larger. He had spent 5 years believing the matter closed. The severance agreement Daniel signed under pressure, exhausted and running low on savings, had included a standard confidentiality clause, one Voss had personally insisted on adding at the time, though he told himself back then it was simply routine legal caution rather than anything closer to self-preservation. Somewhere in a stack of old personnel files, a single name flickered briefly across a screen during a routine background check for building access clearance. Voss saw it for less than a second, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction he quickly smoothed over before anyone else at the table noticed. The name on the screen was Daniel Whitfield. What was it about one maintenance worker's name that could unsettle a man who had survived 20 years of boardroom battles without flinching once? During a live safety walkthrough, with press cameras rolling through every hallway, Daniel spoke up for the first time in months, calmly pointing out an anomaly on the technical floor that the outside consultants Voss had hired assured everyone did not exist. His voice stayed low and measured, without a trace of theater in it, the voice of a man who had said similar things once before and paid a heavy price for saying them. Alexandra, standing under the full weight of live coverage and boardroom expectations, cut him off sharply in front of everyone in the room. She told him this was not the place for a maintenance employee to offer engineering opinions, and the words landed harder than she intended, sharpened more by stress than by any real cruelty in her heart. Cameras caught the exchange from 3 different angles. Reporters caught the silence that followed it, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that lingers in a room long after the sound has faded. Daniel did not argue back. He simply nodded once, turned, and was asked to leave the room while dozens of strangers watched him walk out in silence, his boots quiet against the marble floor. Somewhere in the crowd, a young engineer who had once studied his old published work in a college course without ever connecting the name to the man in the maintenance uniform stood frozen, unable to place why the moment felt so wrong. He walked out without raising his voice, without defending himself even once, carrying the kind of composure that comes only from a man who had already lost something far bigger than public opinion years earlier. A young reporter near the doorway lowered her camera slightly as he passed, something in his face making her hesitate before deciding not to ask the obvious follow-up question everyone else in the room was clearly thinking. Boss watched him leave from across the room, and his expression was not smug or dismissive the way Alexandra's had briefly been. It was wary, almost afraid, the look of a man watching a ghost calmly walk out of a building he thought he had buried for good 5 years earlier. Later that evening, alone in his truck outside the tower, Daniel sat with both hands on the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, saying nothing, feeling nothing. He allowed himself to name out loud. Somewhere behind him, the tower's lights clicked on floor by floor, indifferent to the man who had once given it its shape. He picked Nora up from her after-school art class that evening, and when she asked why he seemed quiet, he told her only that it had been a long day at work, the same answer he always gave her when the truth was too complicated to explain to a 9-year-old. She showed him a new drawing, this one of a house with a chimney too large for its roof, and he told her it was the best one yet, meaning it completely. Why would the one person defending the tower's safety be the very person humiliated for trying to speak up? That night, long after the cameras and reporters had gone home, Daniel returned alone to the technical floor carrying a small case of instruments he had kept hidden in the back of his closet for years, tools no ordinary maintenance worker would ever own or even know how to properly use. He moved through the space with the practiced authority of a man who had once designed every load-bearing system in the entire building himself, years before anyone here had reason to doubt him. His hands did not hesitate once. He tested the anomaly point by point, cross-referencing readings against numbers only he would still recognize by memory, and within an hour he understood the uncomfortable truth. This was not a simple sensor error. This was the direct result of materials quietly substituted below the original specification, a shortcut buried carefully under layers of paperwork and time and signatures no one had bothered to double-check. Somewhere below him, the building settled with the faint, familiar groan every structure makes at night, a sound most people never noticed, but one Daniel had spent years learning to read like a second language. He listened to it now the way a doctor might listen to a patient's breathing, searching for the particular irregularity that told him something deeper was wrong beneath the surface. He sat back against a support beam, breathing slowly in the dark, caught between 2 versions of the man he had become. Reporting this meant stepping back into a fight that had already cost him nearly everything once before. His career, his reputation, 2 years of savings spent on a lawyer who eventually told him there was nothing left to fight. Staying silent meant risking lives inside a building where his own daughter's school stood only a few blocks away, close enough that she sometimes waved at it from the playground during recess. He opened an old metal box he had carried quietly from apartment to apartment for 5 years, without ever once showing anyone what was inside it. Folded within were original blueprints, yellowed slightly at the edges, stamped clearly with his own name as lead structural engineer, dated 5 years earlier. Before his name had quietly been erased from every current record the company still kept on file. Underneath the blueprints lay a stack of old emails he had printed and saved, correspondence between himself and the project's original materials supplier, showing the specifications he had approved and the cost estimates that came with them. Beside those sat a second, unfamiliar set of purchase orders he had never seen before, dated only weeks after his termination, listing a cheaper substitute material for the same structural components, approved under a signature that was not his own. He traced one finger along his own signature at the bottom corner, remembering a version of himself who had once believed competence alone was enough to protect the people who trusted him before he learned otherwise the hard way. He remembered the meeting 5 years earlier where he had first raised the concern, remembered Voss's calm assurance that it would be handled. He remembered the termination letter that arrived less than a month later, citing reasons that bore no resemblance to the man he actually was. What happened 5 years ago that turned the building's own original designer into an anonymous man mopping its floors at midnight? Weeks of quiet tension inside Kane Dynamics finally broke during a live evacuation drill attended by major investors and several local officials. On the 22nd floor, a structural alarm blared unexpectedly, sending a sharp jolt of panic through a room meant to project total, unshakable confidence. Investors froze mid-conversation, drinks still in hand. Security scrambled through the hallways, radios crackling with conflicting instructions. For nearly 2 unbearable minutes, no one in leadership knew for certain whether the alarm was real or simply another malfunction in a system already showing signs of strain. Voss moved fast, publicly blaming an outdated sensor and pressuring the engineering team to sign off on safety certification immediately. Before the story could spread any further beyond the building's own walls, he pulled 2 junior engineers aside personally and made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that their continued employment depended on their signatures that afternoon. One of the investors, a silver-haired man from a pension fund that had committed millions to the project, asked pointedly whether this kind of malfunction had happened before, and Voss answered smoothly that it had not, a lie delivered with the same practiced ease he used for everything else that week. Somewhere in that chaos, Alexandra's phone buzzed with a message from Nora's school, only a few blocks from the tower, informing parents of a brief precautionary lockdown due to the commotion nearby. Daniel, working emergency response on the ground floor at that exact moment, received a similar call only minutes later, his daughter's small voice trembling faintly in the background behind a teacher's calm reassurance. For a long, unbearable moment, he stood torn completely between the tower he was sworn to protect and the only person in the world he could never afford to lose, his radio in one hand and his phone in the other. He forced himself to finish silencing the alarm system first, telling himself Nora was safe behind locked doors with a teacher who knew exactly what to do, even as every instinct in him wanted to drop everything and drive straight to her school. Daniel had been the one to physically shut off the alarm from a panel on the ground floor, following protocol exactly while his mind raced through every possible cause at once. He knew, even before anyone confirmed it later, that this was connected to the same anomaly he had flagged weeks earlier, the kind of connection only someone who had once designed the entire system could make so quickly. By the time the alarm finally fell silent, and the investors were calmed with practiced smiles and rehearsed apologies, something else had quietly disappeared from the system entirely. The sensor log that had recorded the incident was already deleted, wiped clean before anyone even thought to ask who still had access to it. Inside the tower, once the investors had been ushered safely back to the lobby with sparkling water and reassurances, Alexandra pulled Voss aside privately and asked him directly whether there was any real cause for concern. He looked her in the eye without hesitation and told her no, that the whole incident was nothing more than an aging sensor overdue for replacement, a story so calm and confident that she chose, against a small flicker of instinct, to believe him completely. Daniel found Nora that evening waiting by the school gate, cheeks pink from the cold, and when she ran into his arms without knowing anything about what had happened inside the tower that afternoon, he held her a little longer than usual, saying nothing about any of it, grateful simply that she was safe and unaware. Who inside Kane Dynamics needed that data gone badly enough to erase it within minutes of the alarm going quiet? Daniel could not let it go. Late that same night, he returned to the control room alone, his old badge still active from his maintenance clearance, and began the slow, careful work of recovering the deleted logs, using methods far beyond what any ordinary technician on staff would ever know how to perform. The recovery process itself took patience most people did not have, sifting through fragments of overwritten data one corrupted file at a time, piecing together timestamps and readings the system had tried to erase completely. Two security guards found him there near midnight and moved to physically remove him from the room, hands already reaching toward his arm without hesitation, voices raised in warning. Daniel did not raise his voice even once. He simply looked at them, steady and unblinking, and said one quiet sentence about what would happen to their jobs if the real data ever surfaced publicly, and it turned out they had stopped the one person trying to protect people inside this building. The two guards exchanged a slow glance, lowered their hands, and stepped back without another word between them, the kind of silence that only comes from men who suddenly sense they are standing near something far bigger than their pay grade was ever meant to cover. By the time Daniel finished, the recovered file confirmed exactly what he had suspected. Timestamps showing the original alarm data deleted less than 4 minutes after the drill ended, far too quickly for any routine system cleanup. He copied the recovered log onto a small drive and slid it into his jacket pocket before anyone else arrived. Voss arrived minutes later, alerted by a private call from security, and found Daniel still working calmly at the terminal, unhurried, as though he had every right in the world to be there. He accused him instantly of unauthorized system access, his voice sharp with something closer to fear than actual authority. Security cameras captured the entire exchange in high definition, every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression crossing both their faces. By morning, the most critical segment of that footage had quietly vanished from the archive on Voss's direct and personal order, deleted with the same quiet efficiency Daniel himself had once used to recover it. Daniel walked home before sunrise that morning, the city still and gray around him, carrying inside his chest the strange, heavy calm of a man who had already decided he would not stop now, no matter what it cost him this time. He thought of the drive he had a few nights earlier, the stranger in the gray coat he had helped without a second thought, and wondered, briefly, whether she had any idea how closely her company's future and his own past were now tangled together. Why would a man with absolutely nothing to hide be so desperate to erase a few minutes of video? Alexandra could not shake the strange familiarity in the way Daniel had handled himself that night. The calm authority that did not seem to belong to a man officially listed on payroll as unskilled labor. Late one evening, alone in the archive room long after the rest of the office had emptied out, she pulled his personnel file simply out of curiosity and found something that stopped her cold in her chair. Buried beneath years of routine paperwork was an older record, one that listed Daniel Whitfield as lead structural engineer for the very tower she now ran, 5 years earlier, with performance evaluations rated exceptional in every single category listed quarter after quarter without exception. The termination note beside his name cited underperformance, a phrase that made no logical sense next to the glowing evaluations attached directly beneath it. She read the file twice, then a third time, certain she had somehow misunderstood. A colleague from the finance department, passing by the archive room on her way out, noticed Alexandra still at her desk well past 7 in the evening and asked if everything was all right. Alexandra only said she was catching up on old records, unwilling yet to say out loud what she suspected she had found. She called down to Human Resources the next morning, asking quietly whether anyone still had contact information for Daniel Whitfield's old supervisor from 5 years earlier, only to be told that the supervisor in question had retired and moved out of state, and that most records from that period had been archived off-site. She brought the discrepancy straight to Voss the following morning, expecting a simple explanation. He offered none at all, waving it off as ancient history that had nothing to do with the present moment, his eyes avoiding hers just long enough for her to quietly notice a small hesitation she had never seen from him before in 12 years of working together. Near the bottom of the file, almost completely erased, a single handwritten note remained, most of it blacked out, except for a few surviving words that still made her stomach tighten. Report blocked on direct order of. The rest of the sentence was simply gone, cut off mid-thought, as if someone had wanted it destroyed entirely and had only run out of time. That night, Alexandra sat alone in her office, long after everyone else had left, staring at Daniel's old evaluation scores glowing on her screen, quietly beginning to understand how badly she had misjudged a man based on nothing more than the uniform he happened to be wearing that morning in front of the cameras. She thought back to the rainy night weeks earlier, the quiet stranger who had driven her home without asking for anything in return, and a slow, uneasy recognition began to settle over her as she compared the employee photo on her screen to the memory of his face in the dark truck, whose order was powerful enough to bury an entire engineer's career under one single falsified line 5 years ago. 3 days before the official grand reopening, Alexandra made a decision that surprised even herself when she thought about it afterward. She quietly reached out to Daniel and asked him to present his findings directly to the board and to the press, in person, without filtering his words through anyone else standing between them this time. He agreed, not for vindication, but simply because the building was still standing on ground he no longer trusted, and because Nora's school was still only a few blocks away. Alexandra had spent the previous evening preparing the board for what they were about to hear, choosing her words carefully so that no one would dismiss Daniel before he even had the chance to speak. Still, she knew Voss well enough to expect he would not go down without trying to take Daniel with him. Inside the packed boardroom, Voss struck first, trying to dismantle Daniel's credibility before he could even finish a single sentence, calling him a bitter former employee, inventing a story purely out of resentment and jealousy toward a company that had moved on without him. The room tensed immediately, cameras rolling from every angle, board members exchanging uneasy glances across the long, polished table. One older board member, who had sat on the committee since the tower's original groundbreaking, leaned forward slightly, studying Daniel's face as though trying to place a memory he could not quite reach. Toward the back of the room, 2 junior engineers who had signed the falsified certification during the evacuation drill exchanged a quick, nervous glance, both of them suddenly aware of how much trouble their signatures might now represent. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply opened his laptop, displayed the recovered sensor logs beside the original blueprint bearing his own name, and set them directly next to the falsified safety report Voss had submitted only weeks earlier. The numbers did not match. The materials listed did not match. The signatures did not match. One by one, the discrepancies filled the screen behind him, undeniable and cold under the fluorescent lights, each new slide landing heavier than the last. Voss's voice rose, desperate now, accusing Daniel of fabricating evidence purely out of vengeance for what happened years ago, his composure finally beginning to crack in front of the very people who had trusted him for decades. He turned to Alexandra directly, appealing to years of family friendship, reminding her that he had stood beside her father at this very table more times than he could count. She said nothing in response, her expression unreadable, waiting for Daniel to continue. The room grew tense enough that people could hear the air conditioning humming faintly overhead, the only sound besides his own raised voice. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice low, even, and completely final. "I don't need anyone in this room to believe me the way they should have 5 years ago. I only need this building not to come down on someone's head today." Silence swallowed the entire room whole, absolute and heavy, the kind no one at that table dared to break first. Near the back, one of Voss's assistants quietly slipped out through a side door, and no one who noticed her leaving thought for even a second that it was simply a coincidence. Alexandra sat perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the man she had once dismissed in front of cameras now hold an entire boardroom silent with nothing but the truth laid bare on a single screen. She thought briefly and painfully of her father, and wondered whether he would have recognized this same quiet competence the moment he first met Daniel, long before she ever had the chance to. If Voss had acted alone 5 years ago, why did someone else feel the sudden need to run the moment the truth finally appeared? Word moved through the building faster than any official statement could contain it, whispered between departments long before the press ever caught wind of what had happened in that boardroom. By lunchtime, most of the staff already understood, in broad strokes, that everything they had been told about the tower's safety was about to change. The board convened an emergency session that same afternoon, and by evening, the full picture was complete. Recovered sensor logs, the original blueprint bearing Daniel's signature, internal emails from 5 years earlier showing Voss ordering the structural warning suppressed to protect the opening timeline and construction budget, all of it laid out in one undeniable sequence on the conference room screen for every board member to see clearly. Voss was suspended on the spot, escorted from the building under the same fluorescent lights where he had once dismissed Daniel in front of live cameras. Several employees who happened to be in the lobby that afternoon stopped what they were doing to watch, and no one moved to comfort him or wish him well on his way out, a silence that said more than any statement the board would later release. The grand reopening was postponed indefinitely while the structural corrections Daniel had outlined were implemented exactly as he specified, down to the smallest reinforced beam on the lowest mechanical floor, inspected twice by independent engineers before anyone signed off again. The news reached local television by the following morning, and though the segment focused mainly on the safety corrections and the board's swift action, a photograph of Daniel, standing at the podium beside Alexandra, ran alongside the story. Nora's teacher recognized him immediately and mentioned it gently to her the next day at school, and Nora came home that afternoon, asking her father, with wide, curious eyes, whether he was famous now. Daniel told her no, only that he had simply done his job, and left it at that. Alexandra stood before the full staff of Kane Dynamics 2 days later and did something her father rarely had, admitting fault publicly, without softening a single word of it for optics or comfort. She acknowledged that she had judged a man by his uniform instead of his record, and that the mistake had nearly cost the company far more than money could ever repay, in front of employees who had watched her humiliate him weeks earlier. As security cleared out Voss's office, he paused at the door, and without turning around to face anyone, said quietly that he had not been the only one who knew, not 5 years ago, and not now either. Then he walked out, leaving the sentence hanging heavy in the air behind him, like an unfinished blueprint no one dared to pick up and finish. Alexandra watched him go from the hallway, arms crossed, already wondering how far this actually went beyond one man's decision made 5 years ago. By the following week, an independent audit team had been brought in at the board's insistence, tasked with reviewing every safety decision made under Voss's tenure over the past decade, a process everyone understood would take months to complete properly. Their preliminary findings, released quietly to the board alone, confirmed that the substitution scheme uncovered in the tower extended to at least 2 other Kane Dynamics properties completed during the same period, both of which were scheduled for immediate reinspection. Word of what happened spread quickly through the company, and by the end of that week, several former employees who had left under similarly vague circumstances began quietly reaching out to the new legal department, wondering if their own old files deserved a second look as well. At home that night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table long after Nora had gone to bed, reading through the board's official statement on his phone, his name printed in full for the first time in 5 years, alongside the words wrongfully terminated. He did not feel triumphant reading it, only tired in a way that finally felt earned rather than defeated, the particular exhaustion of a long fight that had actually ended in something resembling justice. What was Voss really protecting all these years, and who else had been standing quietly behind him the whole time? 6 weeks later, Daniel returned to Kane Dynamics not as a maintenance worker, but as the company's new chief structural safety advisor, a title that finally matched a career interrupted 5 years too soon by one man's convenient lie. The tower reopened with new reinforcements quietly built into every floor Daniel had once flagged, safety measures no camera would ever showcase for the press, but every engineer walking those halls understood their true weight and what it had taken to get them installed. Gary, the maintenance worker who had once mentioned the faulty sensor without knowing what it meant, was among the first to congratulate Daniel, shaking his hand a little too firmly and joking that he always knew there was more to him than the uniform suggested. Daniel only smiled, the kind of small, private smile of a man who no longer needed anyone's approval to know his own worth, though it still meant something to hear it said out loud. At the reopening ceremony, Nora stood beside her father in a small navy dress, staring up at the tower with an expression closer to wonder than pride, as if she finally understood, in some small 9-year-old way, why her father always checked things twice before letting her leave the house each morning. She had brought her drawing of the bridge, now finished, the lines meeting cleanly in the middle exactly the way he had once shown her. Daniel tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket before the ceremony began, promising her he would keep it there for the whole night. Alexandra stood a few feet away, watching the two of them without interrupting the quiet moment between father and daughter, something visibly softer in her posture than the composed executive the cameras usually captured on live television. She had spent the last 6 weeks learning, slowly and without fanfare, what it actually meant to look past a uniform before forming a judgment about the person wearing it. In that time, she had also personally reviewed every safety recommendation Daniel submitted, no longer skimming past his name to reach a summary written by someone else, and had come to recognize, quietly, that his careful, unhurried way of speaking usually meant he had already considered every possible outcome twice before saying a single word out loud. As fireworks lit the evening sky above the tower, Alexandra stepped closer and rested her hand gently on Daniel's shoulder, saying nothing at all in that moment. He did not turn to look at her right away. He simply reached up, briefly covering her hand with his own, his eyes still fixed on the building he had once helped design and had now, finally, helped save from itself. Nora tugged lightly at her father's sleeve, pointing up at the fireworks scattering gold light across the glass tower. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel let himself simply watch the sky instead of the structure beneath it, letting the moment be exactly what it was, without measuring it for weaknesses. Somewhere in the crowd behind them, a photographer from the local paper captured the three of them together, though none of them noticed the shutter click, too absorbed in the light overhead to think about how the moment might look from the outside. Somewhere below them, in the lobby now bearing both her father's name and a small, unmarked plaque honoring the safety review team, the building hummed with the quiet, steady sound of a structure finally at peace with itself. Neither of them had been looking for this, but standing there, beneath a tower that finally stood on solid ground, both Daniel and Alexandra understood that some things did not need to be said out loud to be true.